Right, my name is Stu Wallace. I'm a professor of history here, and this has nothing to do with my knowledge of history, although I do want to know why my apple trees this year came out with golf ball size apples, but that's okay. This is going to be a fun presentation. I actually told an apple story in one of my classes today. I was talking about the New England mill girl era of roughly 1830 to 1850, and it was a culture clash because these young women from New England farms would go into the industrial cities and work, and they didn't really know much about cities, but they would write home. That was part of the prerequisite. Parents wouldn't let them go to the cities unless they wrote home. And one woman wrote home about her unusual experiences, but the most unusual was, she said, "Can you believe it? I had to buy an apple." They was from a farm. You don't buy apples in the farm. You pick it off the tree. But that was the most shocking thing that happened to her, was the fact that she got to the city, she had to buy an apple. So that was my apple story for the day. Our speaker tonight is John Bunker, the apple whisperer from, I love this, Super Chili Farm from Super Chili Palermo, Maine. I know nothing about Palermo, Maine, but John is the expert on apples. And will tell us all there is to know about apples in New Hampshire, Maine, New England, wherever. And he's brought some samples here which look good enough to eat. And so you're just going to have to look at them. But without anything more from me, I'll turn you over to John Bunker.
Here I am against the screen. So we did bring apples to eat, and so if you can stick around afterwards, we have some apples. They're coming in a few minutes. I just was driven up to the door and raced in. So my apologies for being late. I won't even begin to attempt to explain. But my apologies, and thank you for sticking around. I'm not even sure how long you want me to talk, Steve.
It's usually a half hour, 45 minutes. However long you'd like to.
Okay. So it's probably 6:30, which it is. So I'll talk for about half an hour, 45 minutes, and then we'll do questions. And afterwards, we'll have some New Hampshire apples, but they were grown in Maine. Sorry, to eat, and I'll stick around as long as any of you want to answer your questions or whatever. So let's plunge in with this. We might as well go way back, and if we're going to understand the history of apples in New England, New Hampshire, we have to start with a little quick mini botany lesson that some of you probably know and some of you probably don't know. That is this: that if you extract a seed from a Macintosh tree and you plant the seed, if you treat it well, it'll grow into a tree, it will produce fruit. The fruit will not be Macintosh. And did everybody know that? Or did anybody know that? Or okay. So that is, so to take that a little step further, if you planted 10,000 Macintosh seeds, and they all turned into trees, they all produce fruit, none of those would be Macintosh. They wouldn't be Honeycrisp or Red Delicious or Northern Spy or anything else. They would all be new and unique. Every apple seed that has ever been is new and unique. Now, on your Macintosh apple tree, all the fruit will be Macintosh all the time. Actually, it's not entirely true. 1 out of maybe 1 million might mutate, but essentially every apple on that Macintosh tree will always be Macintosh. The seeds, however, are different. Every seed is unique. So this is absolutely key. In fact, it's really probably the most important factor in the history of apples in New Hampshire or anywhere, the history of apples. So that's number one. Number two is, and I guess I could elaborate on that a little bit, that notion or that fact that every apple seed is unique, the apple seeds in that regard are like each one of us. So we are a genetic combination of mom and dad, everybody here is, and you could have 10 siblings or 20 siblings or 50 siblings, and every one of you would be different. So just like that, all apple seeds are also different. So they are a genetic combination of mom and dad, and in the case of an apple, you could say that mom, although they aren't specifically male and female so much, but some plants do have a male plant and a female plant. But you have your flower and on the Macintosh tree, and a bee comes along with a little bit of pollen from a Red Delicious or Honeycrisp or a Cortland or something, and dabs a little bit on that and pollinates it, and then you get a fruit, and then inside the fruit you get the seed. So on any given Macintosh tree, you might have 1,000 fruit or 5,000 fruit or whatever you have. Every one of those might be pollinated by a different variety. That doesn't make any difference. As I said, the fruit is always going to be Macintosh, but it's going to be those seeds. They're all going to be different. And in a given apple, you might have 10 seeds, but every seed, even in that apple, every seed's going to be different. So what I like to say is every seed unique. So that's what we need to remember there. Okay. Secondly is a little quick geography lesson. So these apples here that I brought today, and I didn't bring this one. We'll put him behind. All these apples that I brought, you can't see them too well, but maybe you can sort of see them. They are different varieties. Now, apples are of the genus Malus, which is spelled M-A-L-U-S. And there are multiple species of apples. Macintosh is not a species. Neither is Honeycrisp or Northern Spy or Golden Russet. Those are varieties. But there are multiple species of apples but botanists disagree, or there's some confusion or just disagreement. But about 40 species of apples. And they are all native to the Northern Hemisphere. Most of them, the majority of them, are native to China. A few are native to the US. But these apples here are primarily from one species of Malus. And that species is, some people call it Malus domestica, or some people say Malus. Malus domestica, then sometimes they say Malus pumila, and sometimes they say Malus civersii. And most recently, what I've been hearing from botanists is Malus civersii. But anyway, it's all the same. It's all the same thing. It is probably, these apples are probably mostly of one species. I'm getting a little bit technical, but it's all right. And that species is not native to North America. That species is native to Kazakhstan. So if you've been reading about apples in the last few years, you probably heard Kazakhstan. Well, Kazakhstan is north of Afghanistan. It's part of the former Soviet Union, and is a huge country. And in that country, there is a mountain range called the Tian Shan Mountains, Tienshan, I think. And the Tian Shan Mountains, I have not been there, but the Tian Shan Mountains are either, I think they sort of semi-border a big valley. And that whole area is the same latitude probably has conquered. Does anybody know what is the latitude here? 44? Okay, so that's basically what it is, 45, 44. And so obviously in much of Maine and, whatever. The interesting thing, I mean, there's maybe other things too, but one thing very interesting about this area is that it was never covered by glacier. So it's an unglaciated northern hemisphere location, similar to New Hampshire and Maine, that when we were under 2 miles of ice, they were just merrily producing plants and going through the evolutionary process of developing many interesting plants, not just apples. So for millions of years, plants have been developing in this one location, including what we think, and they're pretty sure they're correct, the apple. So somehow, and that's about halfway around the world. So somehow it got from there to here. How did that happen? So the Middle East was covered with a web of roads, trails, whatever. And we call those the Silk Road. And they did not call it the Silk Road, and it was not a road. It was a web of trails. And you can go on probably Google Maps or something and look at this, and it's just a massive crisscross of connections that connected India and China and South Asia in the east, and Russia and Europe and North Africa in the west. And you've also heard of Marco Polo, and Marco Polo and his father and his uncle were very unusual in that they were some of the only Europeans that got into China. So what was going on? Let's back up a little bit. This was before Magellan and Sir Francis Drake and Henry Hudson and all that stuff with people trading and exploring from the sea. They were doing this. They were doing their trading over land, and the people from the east, the Indians, the Chinese, and so forth, were not going to Europe. They were not going to Russia. Similarly, the Europeans were not going to China. What was happening was everybody was meeting in the middle, and I'm not clear on it. It'd be pretty easy to research. I'm not exactly sure which were the major cities, but I know Baghdad, Damascus, Tehran, all these places that are in the news today, those were all major trading focal points. So goods and raw materials and so forth would go west and would go east, and they would meet in the middle, and the Arabs were the merchants, the traders, who would negotiate the deals and then send it off in the other direction. So it was very rare for anyone to do the whole trip by themselves, and in fact, I think it was almost unheard of, and that's why Marco Polo was so unusual, or actually I think it was his dad and his uncle that did it first. So one of those routes, or maybe even multiple routes, of what we now call the Silk Road, went through the Tian Shan Mountains, where the apples were. And so what researchers think, and if you're super interested in this, there's a book called The Story of the Apple. And it sounds like a kid's book, but it's definitely not. It's very super scholarly sort of research and theories about this whole thing. But anyway, it's called The Story of the Apples, and I highly recommend it. But anyway, what researchers think is that the apple migrated from the Tian Shan Mountains. These are forests of apples, not orchards of apples. Excuse me. And across the Middle East, and then up into Russia, over into Europe, and down into North Africa. So that over time, Russia developed a rich, super rich apple culture. And actually really important to apple growing and the apple history of northern New England, which we will get to in a little bit. And then all through Europe, every place in Europe, the apple migrated and eventually established itself. Now, because the apple does not come true to type from seed, right? Every seed is unique. And because it loves to propagate itself from seed, as you know, I don't know what it was like here a year ago, but in Maine, it seemed like every apple tree in the state was producing huge amounts of fruit a year ago. And so you could really see them. And one of the beauties, I live in central Maine, sort of vaguely near Augusta, and one of the things that was so great about last fall was that you could see that there were just from seed, just everywhere, along every road and every stream, and even along the shore of the ocean, you'd find apple trees growing everywhere, all laden with fruit last year. Not so much this year, but hopefully, if all things go well, we'll get it again next year or some year soon. So the apple seeded itself all over Europe, and then it adapted itself to different regions, so that different regions had different sorts of apples. We'll just call them sorts for now. So eventually, the apple migrated from Europe to the coast of Maine, basically, and the coast of New Hampshire and Massachusetts, all the way down to Georgia, but probably first to the coast of Maine and maritime New Hampshire. And that probably was with Basque and Portuguese fishermen who were fishing before 1600. They were fishing off the coast of Maine, up into the St. Lawrence, Gulf of Maine, whatever, all up and through there they were fishing. This is, before, John Alden and Priscilla and Plymouth Rock and all that stuff. So nobody knows, of course, this is not written about, or, I haven't seen anything written about it. But on those fishing boats were almost certainly apples, and then the apples were certainly tossed overboard, floated up onto shore. They made encampments on the islands off the coast of Maine and maritime Canada, and planted, and either inadvertently or on purpose planted apple seeds wherever they went. So that in past years, on my various visits to islands off the coast of Maine, I see apples there that I don't see on the mainland. Now, maybe I just have missed those varieties and I'm just not familiar with them, or maybe these are the descendants of the descendants of the descendants of those first apples that were brought over a long, long time ago. But we'll probably never know. So then, Europeans began to come to the mainland, obviously, and begin to create farms on the shore, and the little villages began, and so forth, and you know all that. And when they did, they all planted apples from seed. So everybody, pretty much everyone, and now I'm talking, the European settlers, immigrants, pretty much everybody lived on a farm, even if they lived on the salt water, and every farm had an orchard, and every orchard was from seed. So the orchards were really infinitely diverse. They were as diverse as the number of seeds that were planted, because these orchards were from seed. Every tree was unique. So you can imagine the incredible diversity. With if you took everybody here and we all lived on our own individual farms, and we all had, we all had an orchard. Orchards were not big. A big orchard might be 30 trees, maybe. That would be a pretty big orchard. And we all had 30 seedlings. You can imagine 30, there's at least, 30 or 40 of us here today. You're talking thousands just in this room of different apples. And this was going on in New Hampshire, it's going on in Maine, Massachusetts, everywhere, all the way down to Georgia. Tens of millions of apple trees planted from seed. So a just incredible diversity. Now, occasionally varieties were brought over from Europe, and we haven't really even talked about what a variety is yet, but we will. And, but they tended not to do well over here. And in fact, many of the seeds that were brought over here from Europe also did not do well. But enough did well because of, who knows why? Because the apple, for whatever reason, the apple just loves New England. And so they did enough of the seedlings did well so that in a generation, an apple generation from seed is about 10 or 12 years. So from seed, if you planted seed next spring, 10 years from now, and maybe even slightly less, you would get, you would start with something, a little teeny seedling, and within 10 years or so, you'd be eating apples from that tree. So figure that Europeans started coming here shortly after 1600. By 1700, we had at least 8 or 10 generations, maybe 12, 15 generations of apples from seed. The apples were self-selecting like Darwin, and before very long, New England was covered with seedlings, not just ones that people had planted, but had planted themselves because they escaped, and they love to escape and go off and plant and grow wherever they feel like growing. And so they had escaped and had self-planted themselves everywhere. So there were just seedlings, millions of seedlings all over the place. And Johnny Appleseed, John Chapman from Leominster, Mass, was just doing what everybody was doing, which was planting apples from seed. So now I saw that some apples, that 2 bags arrived, and I better get them or something. So now let's pretend we're gonna like it's raining out there in case you didn't notice. We're going to pretend that it's now, we'll say 17, well, sometime a long time ago. And actually I'll wait on these and we'll start over here. So in 1630, Boston, Roxbury, and Dorchester were all incorporated. And they were all farming communities. And those first seedlings that people were planting, for the most part, those seedlings look like this. And I think I have a good example here somewhere. They mostly look like this, right? And you've seen these growing by the side of the road. And this is an apple from seed that we picked somewhere in the last week or two. So this apple is typical of seedling apples. They tend to be, as a group, they tend to be a little more acidic than sweet. So every apple is going to have a certain degree of sugar and a certain degree of acidity. And there will be a balance point where some will be more sweet, some will be more acidic, whatever. Most of the seedlings that I've discovered are a little more on the acidic side than the sweet side, but sometimes you find them that are very, very low in acid. They're a very, not necessarily high in sugar, but that balance point is such that they have, that they taste sweet. And I don't mean sweet like a Honeycrisp tastes sweet. A Honeycrisp is actually not a sweet apple. A Honeycrisp is an apple with a balance of sweetness and tartness that meets our unsophisticated modern tastes. And that was a joke. these apples, these seedling apples tend to be sharp, a little more acidic. They tend to be bitter, and they tend to be astringent. And astringent is like that, lemon. Okay. So these apples are what cider makers today are just searching for. They want them so desperately because of this. Now I'm jumping ahead about 300 or 400 years, but this whole resurgence in cider. These are great cider apples. Now, not all of them, and they vary, but as a whole, as a group, they make way better cider than Angry Orchard will ever be able to make, because Angry Orchard and Woodchuck, and I'm just picking on them because they're big, but generally the cider makers of today are trying to make cider out of the wrong apples, because that's all there is around. It'd be like you trying to make fine wine out of Welch's grape juice. So you can't do it. You can try, but you can't do it. So why do I mention all this? Because that's what people were doing with their apples. They were making cider, and they were drinking vast quantities of cider. And cider it has some good things going for it. It's very low in alcohol. It keeps quite well. So your apples, if you keep them in a root cellar, at the most we'll say, if you have fantastic apples, maybe into next summer. But apples in a juice form, even without distilling it, will last at least a couple of years. So you have this product. It's a great way. Alcohol is a great way to preserve stuff. What do the herbalists do about all their tinctures and their herbs and all that? They preserve them all in alcohol, right? So people grew seedling apples. They grew them primarily for cider. But we were still a long way away from Shop and Save and Hannaford's and Shaw's and Whole Foods, all those. They were still about 300 years away. So if you wanted fresh fruit in the wintertime, you had pretty much only one choice, and that was to grow it yourself. And so immediately upon planting out these seedling orchards everywhere, people began to look for exceptional seedlings. And the first one in America that we know of that is still around, and we can sort of somehow trace it a little bit, its history, is this apple here. And this is called Roxbury russet. And there are many different russets, quite a few. This is probably the most famous. It originated in Roxbury, which was originally spelled R-O-C-K-S, not R-O-X, because if you've ever been to Roxbury and poked around, it's a very rocky, inhospitable area agriculturally, but it grew some great apples, and one of them was this apple. So what happened was somebody in Roxbury, shortly after 1630, maybe nobody knows, 1635, 1640, somewhere around in there, somebody discovered this growing on a seedling that either they planted or their neighbor planted or came up on its own. This has a few really good qualities. One is it tastes great. So now, of course, different strokes for different folks. What one of you likes to eat, the other one might not. And so when I say it tastes great, whatever. Maybe it would to you, maybe not. But in general, people really liked it and still like it as a dessert fruit. A dessert fruit is a fruit that you eat fresh, or as they say in England, with a knife. And so Roxbury russet, good dessert apple. So unlike these spitters or whatever, cider apples, and it also kept in in regular common storage. So, of course, this is also several hundred years before refrigeration. So if you put Roxbury russets, and you could do that today, we have 2 root cellars. Build yourself a root cellar, basically stick them underground, high humidity, low temperatures, but not freezing, and you'll eat these apples until May easily. And they'll be good. And it also makes fantastic applesauce. I like to make applesauce every day from roughly October to May. And I don't mean making like a big vat of applesauce. I mean making like a little saucepan, and I make 3 or 4 apples, cut them up, add them to my oatmeal, and of winter apples, or sometimes these are called keepers or winter apples, storage apples, whatever, Roxbury russet, really, really good. So, but the main thing was it stored really well. So this actually became a popular commercial apple as well, and was sold in markets beginning in the 17th or early 18th century. Okay. So shortly after that, well, not too shortly, but within 50 years, this apple was discovered. So this apple here is Baldwin. So this originated in Wilmington, Massachusetts, in Middlesex County, just outside Boston. You drive through it when you go on 128, and this was another just chance discovery. Somebody, the sort of mythology is that somebody was surveying for the Middlesex Canal, and they found an apple, they liked it, they called it woodpecker because it was a tree that had woodpeckers that seemed to always be there or something. Eventually, a guy named Baldwin sort of became its champion and popularized it, and before long, this apple also became iconic. In fact, if you were going to pick 10 apples, 10 American apples that sort of changed the world, probably Roxbury russet would be one, but definitely Baldwin would be. It's really one of the top 3 or 4 most important American apples that ever were. I should say one other thing a little bit more about russets. Russet is it's a skin condition. Botanists don't, or whoever it is, plant pathologists or whoever it is that study apples, apple physiology, do not completely understand what russeting is. We were just, my wife and I, who was here a few minutes ago, were just out in Geneva, and we were talking to a graduate student there who was studying russets, and he was saying that it may be, they think now that it may be that the layer of flesh under the skin outgrows the skin and bursts through, and that is what russeting is. But nobody's, I'm not even sure they're completely clear on that. But it sort of feels like suede a little bit when you touch it, or maybe like unglazed pottery or something. Many apples do it. Commercial growers hate it because it doesn't look good in Hannaford's display case, so they do everything they can to avoid it. This guy who we met in Geneva, this at Cornell, was saying that there's a possibility that russet apples are the healthiest apples for you. So it may be that eventually everybody's going to want russet apples after for so long, vilifying them or whatever. So and there are many, many russets. So then this apple came along in Maine. So Baldwin about 1740 or so. This is Black Oxford. So this originated, fairly close to New Hampshire in Oxford County. Paris, Maine, and this is another winter keeper. It makes a good pie. It's a good all-purpose apple, as is Baldwin. These are particularly good pie apples. So when people found these seedlings, so these apples from seed that they really liked, then what they wanted to do was they wanted to propagate them so that other people could have them as well. And that's where I was going to go with these bags here. And so if this was, say, about 1800, no, again, nobody knows for sure, then maybe we would have this party here today instead of a talk, and one of you would bring this apple here with you, and which looks a little bit like this apple that somebody brought, but it's not the same apple. And so maybe one of you would have brought this apple with you. This is, and you pass it around, cut it up with a knife, pass it around, and everybody says, oh, geez, love that apple. And so I say to you, so I want this apple, please, I want this apple. I got to have it in my orchard. And you say, okay, here, have the seeds. And I say, I don't want the seeds. I want the apple. So that's where grafting comes in. So when you graft, you take, and by the way, this apple is called Milden, M-I-L-D-E-N, or Milding, M-I-L-D-I-N-G. And this originated in Alton, which is not far from here, right? A little bit northwest of here. Alton, New Hampshire. So this is one of the, I would say, I think sort of iconic New Hampshire apples. And it is, well, I'll try to remember to tell you more about it. I'll tell you a little bit about grafting first. Okay, so when you graft, you take a small snippet of a twig from the milding tree, and you do that in January, February, March, early April, when it's dormant. And the piece of the twig that you need in order to do the graft is the size of a birthday candle, right? You know, those little packets of birthday candles, and they have little candles that are this long, and they're spiraled, and they're slightly thinner in diameter than a number 2 pencil. That's what you cut, a teeny little snip. And you take that and you splice it, that's called the graft. You splice it with a very sharp knife and some fancy knife work onto an apple tree that is rooted. And in the old days, they used seedlings, because that's what they had. You know, everybody was planting apples from seeds, so there were just seedlings everywhere. And you splice it onto that apple tree, that seedling apple tree, and from that junction point on, that's the graft, you will have Milden, or Roxbury Russet, or Black Oxford, or Baldwin, or whatever. And so by that method, and you can imagine if that's all it takes, then once one of us in this room has a milding tree, then and as soon as that tree gets to be maybe 6 or 7, 8 years old and starts to put on some growth, everyone in here can have one, because that's just a very small amount of growth that we need in order to start a new tree. And so very quickly on, beginning as soon as Europeans were here, the first selections were being made of seedlings. And this was the beginning of the, and in England they say pomology. That means like a sort of a list of apples. So we'll say this was the beginning of the American pomology. This was the beginning of the American varieties. And it began with Roxbury Russet, as far as we know, and then everywhere people were growing apples from seed, which was everywhere. Everyone was engaged in this process. So if we right here, let's say some of you look like you're here with a spouse or a friend or something, that you live on the same farm together, but let's say there's 30 different farms here represented. Every one of us would be involved in that process of out there observing our seedlings and looking for the ones that still hung on the tree in November. If they're still hanging on the tree in November, chances are pretty good they're not ripe yet, because when they're ripe, they drop. So that might mean that there's a candidate that might do well in the root cellar. So you take them and put them in the root cellar, see how they are in January, February, or March, because they may not taste very good now. They might be kind of starchy and bland. But wait till February and they may be fantastic. So people would make discoveries, and then they would begin to pass them around by grafting. And the names then they would name them. Now, in the case of, let's say, here we're in Concord, right? So we discover an apple here, and it's sweet, so we call it Concord Sweet. And so then it migrates down to Nashua, and next thing you know, down in Nashua, it's being called the Nashua Yellow, and then it migrates over to, whatever, to Manchester, and they call it the Manchester, Special or something. And nobody cared, because these were not marketing opportunities. These were not trademarked. These were not in the grocery store. This was just a way of referring to something that your neighbor had. And so the names, these apples had, some of them had, we don't even know how many synonyms, maybe 5 synonyms, 10 synonyms, 20 synonyms. Nobody was counting, nobody cared. The apples just spread. And so and so is there an official thing that makes something a variety? No. So they just, if you want to call it a variety, you call it a variety. And if you want to give it a name, you just gave it a name, and off it went and got spread around. And so the first ones that were selected were probably the keepers. But then there were the ones that ripened in June or July or August. Up here it wouldn't be June or July, but it'd be early August. Or the ones that made really good pies, because if you've ever tried to make a pie, the stuff in the grocery store, they're all junk. They're worthless for making pies. And so a good pie apple is a very, very valuable thing. It has to cook in a very certain amount of time, and the crust can't collapse, and it's got to have a certain kind of flavor and all that. So, and then there were apples that were used to make molasses, like this apple over here. This is another old iconic New England apple, so old nobody knows even where it's from. We think maybe Dorchester. This is Tolman Sweet. It always has, not always, but many of them on a tree will have this line. It's called the suture line here. This line that goes from the cavity down to the basin. This apple, I was talking about acidity and sugar balances. This apple is heavily weighted on the sugar side, so it has very low acidity. So for us, it just tastes bizarre. And I actually really like the flavor, and some people like to eat these fresh, but it's a strange tasting apple. This apple and other sweet varieties, so if you're doing research or reading old apple books and you see pound sweet, pumpkin sweet, Tolman sweet, what does this mean, These were apples that were insipid. They had way more, not necessarily more sugar than another apple, but way more sugar than acidity in the balance within them. Now, if you take an apple like Tolman Sweet and you press it into cider, and of course there was a cider press, at every crossroads, then you take that cider. And now you have an insipid sweet cider. You take that cider, you boil it down, you turn it into molasses. Now you have something that's indistinguishable from molasses. It's delicious, and there's your sugar, because sugar did not become easily accessible to people really until the slave trade really got booming, and they imported, whatever it was, 1 million slaves into the Caribbean to make sugar for everybody, or rum. But anyway, so Tolman Sweet. Other apples, really good for baking. This is another old iconic New England apple. This is blue pearmain. And blue pearmain, again, nobody knows where it originated. Probably somewhere, maybe Middlesex, Suffolk County, somewhere around Boston, but nobody really knows. It's called blue because usually it has sort of a dusty covering on it, but I've handled it so much it's worn it off. And when it has that dusty covering, you'd think it might be pesticides. It's not. It's just a natural film, which is called a bloom. Blue grapes have it. Many blueberries have it, dark-colored blueberries. You've seen it. This apple, when you bake it, and I don't mean in a pie now, I mean when you bake it whole, so you cut out the center and put whatever you want in it, and then you bake this, the skin will not dissolve, it'll hold together, and the flesh will cook perfectly. So you have this thing that you can scoop out with a spoon, and they're exquisite. So that's blue pearmain. And so they would, what they would do is there was no USDA, there were no pomological societies, there were no land-grant colleges. When was UNH founded? Does anybody know? You're all from New Hampshire. Okay, so learn that. But this was before the land-grant colleges came along. So this was a period when, if we had all been around then, we were the plant breeders, and not necessarily just apples. Beans, squash, corn, you name it. We were all out there looking, observing, selecting. So this one, Mildon, or Milding, as I said, originated in Alton. It is another all-purpose keeper. And it probably doesn't keep quite as long as some of the others, but it keeps quite well. And one of the advantages that it has over some of these others, particularly Baldwin, is that it is considerably hardier. So this was grown, I'm sure it was grown throughout this part and further north of New Hampshire and probably into Vermont. I know it was grown in Maine because I found trees there, including this one. And I think it is a fantastic apple. It was grown commercially in, if you know Maine at all, Piscataquis County, which is basically sort of northwest Maine. And I've seen trees even all the way across to the coast of Maine. So Mildon. So in that, and we're gonna, and we have a bunch of these that we can taste afterwards, or I can just give them away. Well, let's keep going from where we were. So by the middle to the end of the 18th century, the seedling orchard culture was firmly in place, and many people were beginning to select seedlings, name them, and propagate them. By 1800, we have the first major temperance movements and the abstinence movements, prohibitions, and so forth that were wreaking havoc with the cider industry and the whole culture of cider. And we also had a bunch of other things going on. One was the improvement of roads. The canals were coming in the early 19th century, followed by the railroads that were coming in, and the roads were getting better, turnpikes, and so forth. And so we were moving from a culture of small, diverse subsistence farms to a culture of small, you might say, semi-commercial, diverse farms. Less subsistence and more economic interaction. In that context it is one of my favorite books, and it's probably, I don't know where it is right now. It might even still be in the car, but I'm not going to read from it. It is called Wild Apples, and it is by Henry David Thoreau. And it used to be that everybody said Thoreau. Now supposedly we're all supposed to say Thoreau. But anyway, Henry David Thoreau, in the last year of his life, which I think, correct me if I'm wrong, 1862, wrote this essay called Wild Apples. It was printed in the Atlantic posthumously. He died in May, and it was printed in the fall. It is fantastic, and it's all about this whole thing of the seedlings and the grafted trees and the turmoil around the transition, because the 19th century was really a transitional period in many ways. Think of it, 1800, no railroads. Think of 1900, 1800, basically. By that span of 100 years really sort of defines really just defined American culture for the next, 120 or wherever we are now. But more and more varieties being discovered, everywhere, all over the eastern U.S., out to the Mississippi River and so forth, being named, so that by about the time of Thoreau's death in the early 1860s, I think about 20,000 named American varieties. So that's very hard to verify because there are so many synonyms and so many varieties that were never actually written about. I've found numbers of varieties that I know are distinct varieties with local names, but they're just not written down anywhere. So we think somewhere around 20,000 named American varieties by about Civil War, just post-Civil War. So, so now I'm going to jump ahead, and it's about 20 past 7, so I'll try to go a little bit. I'll go a little bit longer, and then we'll leave some time for questions and stuff. So, so we'll say we'll jump ahead about 150 years to 1970. Well, no, we'll go back a little earlier. We'll say 1930. So 1930, the winter of 1933-34 was a real whopper of a winter in New England. And it was a big Baldwin crop that year. And that whole process of the transformation of the seedling orchard, the small commercial orchard, the slightly larger commercial orchard, it was beginning to take hold. And the orchard that you would visit in 1930 looked a little more like the orchard you would visit today. But still many small orchards, say 100 trees. That would be kind of a big orchard. That would be part of your operation. You'd have a dairy, you'd have, potatoes, whatever. Then came the winter of 33-34, when 2/3 of the apple trees in New York and New England died in one winter. So that was tens of millions of apple trees. It was the coldest winter on record, plus the temperatures went from way, way, way above zero to way, way, way below zero in sometimes less than 24 hours. Neighbors of mine in Maine who were kids at the time talked about going outside and hearing trees exploding outside in the middle of the winter. I mean, you can imagine tens of millions of trees, and this is all the way out into New York State, all through all of New England. And it was an unbelievably horrible mess. This was before people had easy access to chainsaws. In fact, there may have been basically no chainsaws. They had to somehow clean up the mess. There was one variety that did pretty well through all of that, and that was a very new variety, which was actually not a new variety, but newly discovered and sort of popular, and that was Macintosh. So, so this process of more and more varieties and so forth kind of reached its crescendo about, we'll say, 1880 or so. And then as we began as a culture to develop a commodity form of agriculture, at that point, then the interest in these varieties began to plummet. So in 1862, also you have the USDA being founded. Then shortly after that, you have pomological societies, you have colleges beginning to have ag programs, and you have cooperative extension, and somewhere around 1927 or so, the New England cooperative extension agents got together and said, we're going to reduce the pool of varieties down to 7 varieties, because we want to have we're making a decision that we want to have a commodity form of agriculture, of apple growing, and so we don't need hundreds of old varieties anymore. We want 7 varieties. And so probably, and I'm kind of trying to piece this together, but I think this is pretty much correct, that also coincides with the Depression, of course, 1929, and the WPA, and so crews of men were hired to go out and cut down the dead trees that died in 33, 34, and basically cut down all your other apple trees and give you the firewood and get rid of the old varieties in the process so that we could move on to a modern agriculture, a modern apple pomology, so to speak, that would just include a few select modern varieties. So one of the people involved in this was a man named Lothrop Davenport, and he lived in North Grafton, Massachusetts, and he was head of one of these crews that went around cutting down your orchard for you. And he came to the conclusion that this was wrong. And so he still continued to cut down the trees because that was his job and probably didn't have any other choice. But in the meanwhile, he would come to your house and he would attempt to figure out what you had, and you probably knew. You would tell him what you have. He'd collect scion wood, take it back to his place in North Grafton, and he started probably what was the first, or certainly one of the first, heirloom collection orchards. So he saved about 200 varieties and in his orchard. Eventually that orchard became the orchard of the Worcester Horticultural Society, which eventually became the orchard of Sturbridge Village, and then most recently it's the orchard of Tower Hill Botanic Gardens. And if you have not been to Tower Hill, you should go. Has anybody here been to Tower Hill? Tower Hill. It's in Bolton. I'm pretty sure it's Bolton. Right on 290 between 495 and Worcester. It is really fantastic. It's really not a fruit growing establishment. It's really a ornamental sort of arboretum, whatever. But they have this collection of about 200 some very rare varieties that this guy Lothrop Davenport saved. Now, the same thing was happening with other people around New England, including over here. There was a guy in New Hampshire named Ira Glackens, who was, I think he was an Englishman, and he had an orchard over here. That orchard still exists, and I've been to it, but I'm ashamed to say I can't remember where it was, but it does still exist, although a lot of the trees are gone now. And I don't know that there's a map of what is there even. But people began to say that at least in sort of an underground way, that we needed to protect this germplasm. And so in 1972, I moved to the property where I live now, which is in central Maine, in between Augusta and Belfast in Waldo County. It was not an epicenter of apples. It isn't, and it won't ever be. But it was just typical of small towns in Maine, and New Hampshire and Vermont and Massachusetts, because there were orchards everywhere. Everybody had an orchard. So I found these old trees. You couldn't help but find them. They're just everywhere in every yard. And I would stop and say hello, and can I pick the apples on your tree? I was in my early 20s. And they would say, sure. Next thing I know, Gramps and Grandma are out there poking around in the grass with me, picking the apples and telling me stories about the varieties and teaching me the varieties, because I didn't know, I barely knew a Red Delicious from a Macintosh. And so I began to learn the old varieties. And one day I stopped by an old tree, and I was feeling a little cocky, and I was sort of used to going to people's houses and saying, can I, have the apples on your tree? And they would always, they would say yes, but I always asked. And I made a lot of cider and filled my root cellar. I had built my own root cellar by then. And so I went to one house, and this was in Palermo. It was a really, beautiful old tree. And I had no idea what it was, so I knocked on the door, and the fellow, came to the door and answered. And I said, blah, 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 this is who I am. Can I have the apples on your tree? And he said, no. And I thought, wow, that's like, who's he to tell me that I can't have his apples? And he said, no, but let's go out and look at it together, he said. So we walked out across his lawn to his beautiful tree that was by the side of the road. And on it were these apples here. this apple here. And this is Nodhead. And in Palermo, some people pronounce it knothead, like K-N-O-T-H-E-A-D or N-O-T-H-E-A-D. I've heard the correct spelling, if you could call it that, is N-O-D-H-E-A-D, one word. It originated in Hollis, down on the Massachusetts border in New Hampshire, and it was grown. I'm sure it was grown all around this area here because it is really popular in central Maine. You can find them. You can find old trees all around. I frequently, when I talk to old timers, they'll tell me that they had a knothead tree. It's not a cooking apple. It's a dessert apple. I think it's a very good dessert apple. It's not really a winter keeper. It's sort of a late fall, early winter apple. And so we walked out to his name. Everybody in town called him Papa Glidden. His name was Howard Glidden. And so he took me out to the tree, and we stood there and looked at it, and he said, "I grafted this tree." And he was a very old man at that point. And I thought, oh my God, because I had learned about grafting, and maybe I had even dabbled with it, but I had I never thought I'd ever actually meet someone who had grafted their own tree. And so he then took me into his barn, and he had a little like maybe it was a coffee, one of those coffee cans that used to have the key that you twist around the wire up the band off it, and in it was his grafting knife and some wax, some grafting wax and cloth and whatever, and this was his grafting kit, and so from that experience I became a big fan of knothead, which has another name, which is Jewett's Fine Red, and those are two distinct names for it's the same apple, and I think that really kind of set me off on my grafting career. Also, was meeting Papa Glidden. So I then have spent really the next 30 years or so tracking down these old varieties, attempting to identify them, which is can be very difficult, and then preserving them. And you could do all that too. And one of the things that you should do if you find yourself interested in this is learn how to graft. It's not very difficult to do. It's better if you do it from a person, not from a video. But once you see someone do it and they watch you and they say, no, how about holding it like this a little more, or whatever, then go look at a book or a video or whatever, and maybe you'll get some tips or whatever. But once you know how to graft, then you can go out into the landscape and start looking for apples that you like, and the apples could be from seed. And they could be varieties. They could be new varieties. They could be old varieties. It doesn't make any difference. I have friends who really liked a certain apple, so they tried to identify it. They thought they identified it, so they went to somewhere, Fedco or St. Lawrence or Stark Brothers or Miller's or something, and bought the tree that they thought was going to be the right variety, and then they waited 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, 7 or 8 years, and it fruited, and oops, well, I had that one wrong. So if you know how to graft, you go to that tree, and you take the silent off the tree, you bring it home, and you graft it onto yours, and now it doesn't matter what it was, you've got it yourself. And by that method, I started my own orchard. I started just digging up seedlings from around the neighborhood, planting them at my farm, and then letting them grow for a couple of years, and then grafting them. So when I would find a new rare variety, what I considered to be a rare variety or just a favorite, I would graft it onto another branch. So I might have 10 varieties on a tree or 20 varieties on a tree, but that allowed me to get a taste of different things, and it allowed me and us, when other people became involved, to preserve these old varieties, because once you have it on safe somewhere, then if the original tree dies or gets cut down because the road's widening or the people get sick of having the apples fall on their lawn or something, then you've got that sign wood at your place. Now you can propagate from that. And so about 10 years ago or so, the executive director of MOFGA, Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association, who is a close friend of mine named Russell Libby, who's now deceased, he and I spent a lot of time just talking about this stuff, about preserving genetic heritage and so forth. And he knew that I was running out of space, and which I was. And plus, these apples get sort of schizophrenic if you have 10 varieties on a tree, because some are ripening in August and some in October, and and so he told me that there was a gravel pit that MOFGA had purchased, and that it needed to be renovated. We were going to try to because it had been closed, it wasn't being used anymore. And so over the course of about the last 5 or 6 years, we've terraced about half of the gravel pit and planted rare apples, and we call it the Maine Heritage Orchard. We have about 230 or 40 varieties there now. Some of them are these iconic ones, like there's some other really great ones here. Here's Northern Spy. You've probably heard of Northern Spy, from almost over near Buffalo in western New York. A really excellent keeping apple, also really good pies, sauce, everything. It's just a great apple. And I'll talk about some of these other ones in a few minutes. But anyway, and Baldwins and Black Oxfords. But then we have a lot of apples in our collection that are very rare, because this process of selecting and naming, if there were once 20,000 named American varieties, you can imagine this was going on in every town. And so all over New England and all the other states down to Georgia, there were these interesting local varieties that were being propagated and saved. And sometimes, how are we doing? Shall I go about another 5 minutes, 10 minutes? Is this okay? Are people running out of steam here? Okay, I'll go 10 minutes. Is that okay? Okay. If you need to leave, go, and thanks for coming. So now I forgot where I was. I'm in Concord, New Hampshire. Somebody told me once that Bruce Springsteen, I'm not equating myself with Bruce Springsteen, that he comes into the concerts and he says, hi Concord, and they had the wrong sign there, and he went, hi Detroit, and he was in Chicago or something. I know I'm in Concord. I also know I'm not Bruce Springsteen. So anyway, so some of these varieties. Oh yes, okay. So some of these apples that I've been discovering, and now I've gotten a bunch of my friends and strangers who are now in this with me, that we've been discovering, we don't know what the names are. And we may never know what the names are. And at first I felt like, you know what, I don't know what the name is, so I'm not going to save it. And then I realized that, well, you know what, some of the ones that I have thought I knew the name of, maybe I'm not even correct. And some of my favorite apples, some of the best, the oldest, we find trees that are, this big around. You can take 4 or 5 people and get inside them, that we didn't know what they were. Should we not save them just because right now we don't know the name of that apple? So we started giving them provisional names and started to save them as well. So now the orchard has a sort of a mix of sort of iconic New England apples, some apples that originated in Maine, and others that originated all over New England and out into New York State and even into the upper Midwest and so forth. One of the things that has come up around this, and this will sort of help to kind of wrap things up, and then I'll answer some questions, is that as I've been doing this work, one of the big questions for me has been, why do we do this? What is the value of this? And that's a question that people would ask me. And I try to come up with something. And the history is really interesting. And I think the history is really valuable. Today, I don't know how many of you live in the town where you were born, but more and more of us don't. And we tend to be transient. And so we're sort of rootless, to use a sort of Apple term. And my opinion is that if you've lived in, say, Alton, New Hampshire, if you've lived in Alton for 10 generations or 10 weeks, that's your place. And that when you learn and get in touch with whatever the historical context where you live, that connects you to where you are. And maybe it would be better if we all lived in the same place for multiple generations the way we used to, but we don't. I'm very fortunate. I've lived on the same piece of land for about 45 years, and I'm really happy that I do, but I wasn't born there, and to many people in town, I'm still a sort of stranger from away. But it does connect you with a place, and I think everybody wants that. It is also, another reason why it's good is that it crosses all boundaries. So recently I gave a talk in probably one of the wealthiest houses in Boston. It was gigantic, it was beautiful, it was old, the ceilings were low, creaky, and we sat in comfortable chairs, and it was just over the top unbelievable. And the amount of money that was probably there was amazing. And the people were wonderful, and we had a great time, and it was just a totally delightful experience. And not too long ago, I was in the car with some of the lowest income people in Maine, out driving around the countryside with them showing me trees that they loved and old farms where they had grown up. And I've given talks to every income demographic, every religion, every political party, and apples are something that connect everyone. And I have friends who are commercial loggers. They'll go in, some of them will go in and strip land, but leave the apple trees. They won't touch the apple trees. Now, why is that? It's because they're too lazy to cut them, because they're a pain in the you-know-what? Is it because they want to leave the fruit for the deer? Is it because there's something just different, and I hate to use the word special, but we'll say special, maybe even spiritual, about apple trees? There's something about apple trees that's just so amazing that I feel like I have been so privileged to be able to enter into the lives of everyone in Maine and everyone in New England and even in New York and all over, wherever I go, people welcome me right into their lives. One minute I'm a stranger, and the next thing I know, I'm at their dining room table or their kitchen table, and they're telling me about this or that. They're telling me they didn't think anybody else was ever going to care about their tree, or they're taking me off here or there or whatever. So it is in a world where I think we long for things to bring us together. It's not hard. In fact, it's a no-brainer. It brings us together. Also, try something when you have a chance. And that is go to your local grocery store, or it's Hannaford, Shaw's, Whole Foods, whatever it is that you have that you like to go, big shopping place, and say to them something like this. Now, as you know, And apples ripen in a progression. You know, the first ones in New England, this area would be sort of early, mid-August, we'll say. And the last ones you pick just before they freeze in the tree because you want to store them. So, go to the produce manager and say, you know what, like many other people, I'm starting to get into cooking with apples, and I really am getting into making pies. So I'm wondering, what would you recommend for a good pie apple for mid-August, and one for late August, and one for early September? And I need a pie apple for late September, and I need 2 or 3 for October because that's the height of pie seasons, and then 1 for November, and then 3 or 4 good pie apples for the winter. So then they might call security and ask you to leave, or maybe the produce manager will just say, oh, I've got to go do something now. I'll be back in 5 minutes, and then they go and peek out the door and tell you to leave. That's because and why do I mention this? Well, I mention it because the apple selection in the grocery store is just really junk. You know, I mean, they're sweet, they're crisp, they're juicy, they're all more or less the same. And they have catchy names, and they're all patented or trademarked, and somebody hopefully is making lots of money selling them to us. But they're not pie apples, and they're not sauce apples, and they're not molasses apples, and they're not very good dried, and they don't really make good baked apples either. They are designed, selected for one purpose, and that is to be a crisp, juicy, somewhat sweet, slightly balanced, acidic and sweet dessert apple that you can eat as a snack or as a breakfast, or whatever it is that you like to do. And so what are we going to do? Well, there are currently, I think, 7 billion people living in the world, and no one is breeding new pie apples. So that's pretty dismal. So, and what about the fact that more and more people do want to cook with apples? More chefs want to cook with apples. People want apples that do something besides just get eaten fresh. And with this cider thing going on, everybody's now looking for cider apples. And as I mentioned, the dessert apples are they're just not even worth turning into cider. And that's not the fault of those dessert apples, nor is it the fault of the people who grow them, because that's what they've been taught. They've been taught that it's a fresh eating market. They're doing the best they can. They grow beautiful apples, and for what they do, those are great apples, but they don't do what some of us want apples to do. And so we could say that things are looking pretty grim for anybody that wants to do something interesting with apples, but you know what? The thing is that at the Maine Heritage Orchard and at Tower Hill Botanic Gardens and at other collections, those apples are still here. And the best pie apples, or many excellent pie apples, still are here. And great sauce apples are still here, and great baked apples are still here, and so forth and so on. And actually, many really excellent dessert apples are still here that you would never find in the grocery store because they don't bear annually, or the fruit's a little small, or the trees don't bear huge crops, or whatever. For some reason they've been shunned, like heirloom tomatoes, that for some reason these varieties have been shunned by the grocery store culture. But they're still here, and so we can talk about that everybody should love apples and get along better in life, or we can talk about history, and that's all really important. But it becomes very practical when you think that the orchard the sort of orchard model of the mid to late 20th century is changing, and that people want different things from their apples, and that's only going to change even more. And who knows where it will take us, but we should be prepared for what's going to happen in the future. And part of that mix is to look at what amazing, brilliant people were these farmers who searched and observed and selected and tested and cooked and then eventually named and propagated all these different varieties for us, and many of them grafted trees that are now 150 years old, and they never even saw the fruit off them, So I like to think of us as participating when we go out into the landscape and we look for these rare old apples. I like to think of us as participating in an age-old process, and that process is in taking something from the past that's really good and then handing it off to the future. And it's like a baton being passed in a relay race. And the scion, the little grafting twig, is like the baton. And I take it from the old tree, from the ancient Malden tree or knothead, or there's another great New Hampshire apple called Granite Beauty that I didn't bring today, or the Baldwin or whatever, and I take that little snip of scion and then I'm like the baton passer in the relay race, and I pass it on to the future with the graft, and then the future has it. And we, as we invent the agriculture of the future, we need to be endlessly trying new things, but we also need to be taking the best of the past and passing it along into the future as part of what we do in creating an agriculture for the 21st century. So thank you very much.
If you have questions, can you wait for me to hand you this?
Yeah, any questions? Yeah, thanks for coming.
I recently moved to an 100-year-old farmhouse, and we have 2 apple trees, and I have no idea what kind of apples they are. So when you said, how do you figure it out, how do you do that?
Well, one thing that you can do is gulp, send me fruit. And, I think of that process as being like Sherlock Holmes. So what I generally do is often I'll depending on the, everyone is different, but I'll be looking at, is there any record of when this was planted? I like to determine the age of the tree. Now, you can't do core samples because most old trees are hollow, but you can keep a lookout for trees that you know how old they are. You go visit someone and they say, oh, my grandparents planted these 4 trees in 1920 or something, and then okay, so that's a tree that's 100 years old or whatever. Through contextual clues like when it was planted, because certain varieties were planted at different times, and you also need to determine, is it a seedling or a grafted tree, because New England is covered with seedlings. So if those 2 trees in your yard are seedlings, they could be old seedlings, they could be young seedlings, then they have no name until you give them a name. There are some good books. One of the best, but it won't be exhaustive. In other words, there'll be a lot of particularly local varieties missing, is called Apples of New York by S.A. Beach, spelled like the place you go swimming. That's a really good book, but it's not a key, so you can't. You have to just start, roaming through it. I do apple IDs, and the way that I usually start is, unless I live nearby, is I ask somebody to email me photographs of the tree itself, because from that I can usually tell if it's a seedling, and I can usually tell how old it is. And how old it is hugely valuable in trying to determine, what it is. So
How can you tell the difference between a seedling tree and a grafting?
that's a good question. Seedlings, without getting too much into it, seedlings just have a different look. They tend to look more unkempt. They tend to look more like, say, a maple tree or a birch tree or whatever than an apple tree, although they're definitely, apple through and through. Also, many times you can see the graft on the tree. So even after 100 years, 200 years, the graft can be completely visible. So it would be like a bulge out or a bulge in. If it bulged out, it means that the scion was more vigorous than the rootstock. If it bulges the other way, it means the rootstock was more vigorous than the scion. So sometimes there's a ripple around. Usually the graft is about chest height, but I've seen them, I've seen them up 10 feet and seen them down like a foot off the ground. So another question? Yeah. Oh, right here.
Are you putting these trees on dwarfing rootstocks at all, or?
I do put trees on dwarf rootstocks myself occasionally, just because I like to see what they will do on dwarfs. And I work at Fedco, and I brought Fedco catalogs. If people aren't familiar with what Fedco is, it's a seed company, seed and tree company, and we have some catalogs here you can take and see what we do. At the Heritage Orchard, everything is on what's called a standard, on a seedling rootstock, because we want those trees to be here in 150 years, which if all goes well, they will be. So the beauty of the dwarf tree is that it's a dwarf, so it tends to bear younger. You rarely need a ladder. It's easy to spray, easy to pick, and so forth and so on. And for commercial orchardists today, it's very important to use dwarfs. That's the model that they like to use. But for a preservationist, I think that the seedling tree, the full-size standard tree, is way superior, because it'll just grow and grow and grow. They're much more self-sufficient. They can forage for water and nutrients in the soil. The root systems are wide-spreading. So generally, that's what I recommend. Or that's what I do. Yeah. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, is there a way to genetically fingerprint these different varieties, or do you have to just rely on, the appearance for diagnostics?
No, people are beginning to do that, but one of the challenges with fingerprinting or DNA kinds of things is that you have to have something to compare it to. So some of the varieties that we're discovering, we have names and we have fruit, and we have to somehow figure out how to connect the fruit with the names. But in some cases, there may not be anyone left alive that can say that apple is a, whatever it is. And so until someone definitively identifies one, and then you can use that as your benchmark with which to compare, it can't help. What you can do that works pretty well is you can say, I think these two apples, which I got this one in Maine and this one in New Hampshire, I think this is the same variety. I may not know what the variety is, but I think it's the same. We can test both of them. We can certainly tell whether they're the same. So some stuff is beginning. There's some really fun, creative stuff happening with that, but it's really limited because of the amount of knowledge that has been lost. Another related question is that some people say, well, how many of these old varieties have been lost? And what I like to say is that my thinking is that most of them still are here. It's just that we may never actually be able to identify them. And occasionally, we find them, and when we're able to identify them through, all sorts of means. But in Maine, we're in much better shape than Massachusetts, and maybe it's more like this in New Hampshire, where in Massachusetts much of the farmland was developed, suburbanized, etc. And in Maine, much of that same farmland was abandoned. So Maine right now has, I think, one of the highest, one of the highest amounts of unused farmland in all of the Northeast. Thousands of acres, actually, that was basically just abandoned beginning, even in the 19th century. So along with that abandoned farmland are all these abandoned trees. So, and there's probably a lot of rural New Hampshire that's similar. You can drive down many roads in Maine, many rural roads, and just see seedlings, not seedlings, old ancient trees that are in patterns. So, how do you know if it's in an orchard? Well, if you see 6 trees and they're in 2 rows and they're spaced approximately 30 feet apart, which is approximately the distance between the trees back then, you don't know for sure unless you can see the graft, but you have a pretty good idea that they're old grafted trees, and they're everywhere. They're all over the state. And some of those trees are just more spies and Baldwins and golden russets and Roxbury russets and blue pearmains and so forth. But some of them are these super rare varieties, these local varieties that would be just really great to find. And you just, I find them, and friends of mine who are really getting into this now find them just like one at a time, one by one. I gave a talk. I give a lot of talks, and I gave a talk last winter, and afterwards an older woman came up to me and said, have you ever heard of an apple? We have an apple on the farm, she said, that we always called American Beauty, and that is an old variety. How would she have known that name? So in the middle of the winter, I went out with her. She met me, and we drove out, a couple of hours out to western Maine to her old farm, and there were 2 trees that instantly I knew they were grafted. You could see the grafts, and also the trees were like this big, right next, like 15 feet apart from each other over by the barn. And it's this old variety, American Beauty. So there's another one, And this is not like you're not going to occasionally you might find someone who has, 10 or 15 or 20 or, there's some orchards in New Hampshire. Allison's Orchard, is that one around here somewhere? That have nice collections of some modern and some heirlooms. And then there's Scott Farm over in southern Vermont. And, so there's people that are doing this that have done a lot of this work for us. But a lot of it, it's still out there, and they're there. And there's a few people around that know. They may only know one variety, but if you're just like knocking them off, one here, one there, and so forth. So it can be done. So anything else? Yeah.
Are all apples of similar nutritional value?
That's a good question. So, are all apples of similar nutritional value? So Google, New York Times, it's probably like May of 2015 or 14, maybe like nutritional value of fruit or something, and you'll see an article about that very subject. So, and this gets into a much, it's a pretty big subject, but one of the things that cider makers like about cider is that you use these bitter fruit, and if you live in America, that there's lots of jokes and some not so jokes about kale, and and people love to hate kale, or they love to love kale, or whatever, and other bitter foods, arugula, whatever, Chinese greens. These are all considered to be much better for you because they haven't had the bitterness bred out of them. And I'm not a plant nutritionist, but in this article, the woman who wrote it compares different species of apples with some modern varieties. And so there's an apple, and her research is limited, but there are varieties, there are species of apples that have small fruit, and the fruit is incredibly bitter. And from her research, which may not be exactly correct, but it's probably along the right track, those small bitter apples are way higher in phytonutrients and antioxidants and so forth and so on, all the things that everybody is supposed to be eating, than are the modern dessert fruit. And in this chart, and I can't remember what the numbers were, but this one apple called Malus sycamensis, which we ate out in Geneva recently, and it's about like this big, and it's just bitter as all get out, is like on the scale is like 20,000 or something, and then Golden Delicious on the scale is like 3 or something, So I'm making up the numbers, but that's basically the situation. So chances are that, like with a lot of our food over the last, since agriculture began, 10, 12,000 years ago, that a lot of our food, we've bred out some of the good stuff in order to make it more fun to eat. And so apple's probably the same thing. And that's a very simplistic answer, but basically I think it's so one of the things that cider makers hope is that when you drink cider, another justification for drinking alcohol, that you are drinking this magic elixir of all this bitter juice that is somehow making you healthy, happy, and wise, if not wealthy. And so I had a button that I should have worn that said, "This Thanksgiving, choose cider." So this Thanksgiving, choose cider. Okay, so thank you all very much.